fighters where blood was being harvested from young men. Whether that's true or not is impossible to say. Certainly it does sound lurid, like a tabloid story, but then so do many of the documented acts RSF fighters have filmed themselves undertaking. This is just not a group bound by ordinary ideas of morality. Not even close. In short then, the missing civilians of El-Fasher may not be dead, but they may also be trapped in a kind of living death. The lucky ones held captive by Arab herders until their families can pay a ransom. The unlucky ones disappeared into RSF torture centers, as bleak as anything constructed in Syria during the Assad regime. However, we didn't want to make this video only about the aftermath of El-Fasher. While its fall was undoubtedly one of the worst war crimes committed in decades, it's not like the rest of the war has been a model of gentlemanly conduct. As such, it's time for us to turn our attention to the wider conflict and the reasons to fear that another El-Fasher might soon be upon us. But before we move on to the next part of today's horror show, it's time for just a little bit of a breather. Thank God this episode is incredibly dark to tell you about hopefully something a bit lighter. Frontsco is our new subscriber service, a place where we go into greater depth on topics that the discourse tends to ignore. For just $5 a month, you get access to at least 2 exclusive videos every week, plus in-depth articles written by our stable of experts on important and overlooked topics. Since you're watching a video on Sudan, easily the most ignored conflict of our time, we feel comfortable saying that you care about under-the-radar stuff that definitely shouldn't be under the radar. WarFronts is intended to be an outlet specifically just for that. Just in the last couple of weeks, we've had an in-depth piece mapping the UAE's proxy network across Africa, as well as an examination of whether the RSF could survive without their backers in Abu Dhabi. And every Saturday, our weekly briefing room segment rounds up the most overlooked stories of the last 7 days. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, head to frontsco to check it out. By subscribing, you also help us keep producing this sort of content on the main channel, which is obviously for free. Look, videos on topics like Sudan are important to talk about, but they often run the risk of demonetization on YouTube. Understandably, to be fair, but frontsco helps us make them anyway. And now back to the tragedy of Sudan's incredibly overlooked war. The next El-Fasher. So, when the war in Sudan erupted in April of 2023, plenty of analysts cautioned that if it didn't end quickly, it would take on an increasingly ethnic dimension, one likely to make the fighting ever more bitter and entrenched. Well, over 1,000 days later, those analysts can take a grim satisfaction in knowing that they were absolutely right. Sudanese social media is alive with what we might call hate speech, dehumanizing rhetoric aimed at entire groups that one side suspects of collaborating with the other. As the independent journalistic outfit Sudan War Monitor recently noted, there are significant risks of further ethnic killings as Sudan appears to be continuing down a path of more war, ethnic hatred, and a cycle of revenge. In Darfur, the contours of this are already clear enough. The RSF is on a mission to finish what its predecessor organizations, the Janjaweed, started in 2003, the complete eradication of all non-Arabs from the region. Even before the horrors of El-Fasher, the paramilitaries were accused of the mass killing of minorities, most notoriously in 2 massacres in the city of El Janina, where about 15,000, mostly Masalit, are thought to have died. But as the war has dragged on, ethnic killings have begun to spread to other regions, and they are no longer only being carried out by the RSF. That was the conclusion of a joint investigation by Sudan War Monitor, Lighthouse Reports, and CNN into the massacres of Kanabi farming communities in Al Jazeera state, this time last year as the Sudanese armed forces closed in on Khartoum. One of the key battles in the drive on the city was retaking the Jazeera state capital of Wad Madani from the paramilitaries, a resupply point surrounded by a network of irrigation canals and farmland worked by black Sudanese with roots in Darfur and Kordofan. According to reports at the time, confirmed by this new investigation, the army's victory was accompanied by atrocities against the Kanabi, ranging from the burning of villages to the killing of civilians. The Sudan War Monitor writes, quoting again, SAF and allied forces arrested large numbers of Kanabi residents, killed them, and threw their bodies into the main irrigation canal. End quote. On social media, pro-army accounts celebrated the massacre as just desserts for collaborating with the RSF. But the new report suggests something far more cynical, that the SAF and their allies in the Islamic movement deliberately courted ethnic militias such as the Sudan Shield Forces and Liberation of Al Jazeera Forces with anti-Kanabi rhetoric to swell their ranks ahead of the drive on Khartoum. One source even claimed that the order to slaughter the Kanabi came directly from the Kizan, a Sudanese slang term meaning Islamist politicians. We mention all of this not to engage in weak tea both sides rhetoric. As we've noted in the past, the SAF are definitely not good guys, and they stand accused of horrific war crimes. Yet even their worst acts, they pale beside the Baroque cruelty and the wholesale depopulation of cities carried out by the RSF. Rather, we mention it to show just how much more brutal the war has become as it drags on. How the genocidal glee of the RSF is now being complemented by ethnic massacres carried out by the army and the growing influence of Islamist elements associated with the old regime of former dictator Omar al-Bashir. And that suggests something truly concerning. That there will only be more atrocities, that El-Fasher may not be the climactic horror of this war, but simply the beginning of a new and awful chapter. And look, we don't say such a thing lightly. God knows Sudan has already suffered enough. Millions forced to flee their homes, perhaps 400,000 people dead, the capital city reduced to ruins. The last thing anyone wants to hear is some YouTuber telling them that things could get worse. But they could. As the center of combat moves east of Darfur and into the region of Kordofan, there are signs that more horrors may be just on the horizon. The SAF stronghold of El Abeid, for example, is nearly surrounded, with the RSF indiscriminately attacking the city with artillery and drones. In a recent report, Le Monde declared that, quote, "The city of El Abeid is hanging by a thread. If El Abeid were to fall, the paramilitary rapid support forces would once again be at the gates of Khartoum." Further south, the city of Kadugli is besieged by both the RSF and their allies, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement North, Al-Hilu. The Famine Early Warning System Network released an alert on January the 15th declaring that, and we'll quote them here, "Protracted extreme siege conditions have led to famine, IPC Phase 5 in El-Fasher, North Darfur, and Kadugli, South Kordofan towns." Meanwhile, the International Rescue Committee warns that Kordofan risks seeing more massacres or even another El-Fasher should more of these towns fall to the RSF. At the same time, child malnutrition in North Darfur is reported to have reached 53%, a level UNICEF has called unprecedented. At this point, we've just about run out of words for describing how awful Sudan's situation is. Secret torture centers, an entire city depopulated, more towns besieged, growing ethnic hatred, even as the nation sinks into starvation. It seems likely that in decades to come, this period will be remembered in the same hushed tones as the Rwandan genocide, a moment of international shame when elites dithered while hundreds of thousands of bodies burned. Try and grasp the new words to describe both the horrors of Sudan's war and the fact that the world seems just not to really care about it. We instead want to end on a broader note of caution today, because what is happening in Sudan may be a bellwether for the wider world. System failure. You see, just days before the fall of El-Fasher, the International Criminal Court handed down a landmark sentence, the first it has ever issued for crimes committed in Darfur. Ali Khashayb was convicted of 27 counts of crimes against humanity, including for ordering his men to wipe out and sweep away non-Arabs. The catch? Al-Khashayb carried out those crimes in 2003 and 2004 as part of the Janjaweed militias that later metamorphosed into the RSF. Even as the judges declared that his conviction would act as deterrence for future war criminals, the descendants of his militia were preparing to carry out identical crimes in El-Fasher. And we mention this because if Sudan's war has taught us one lesson, it's this. The international system set up in the wake of World War II just doesn't work. If the ICC can trumpet the sentencing of a man for crimes committed in Darfur over 20 years ago that are identical to crimes being committed in Darfur right now, then it's clear that deterrence is a mirage, that the words "never again" might as well be followed up with at least not until the next time, right guys? Look, right now the ICC is constrained by a 2005 mandate for Sudan that it only investigates crimes committed in Darfur. That means that while the fall of El-Fasher may be under its jurisdiction, future crimes committed by the RSF in Kordofan just won't be. The SAF killings of Kanabi farmers are not covered, nor are the abuses carried out by the RSF while it controls Khartoum, abuses that included the construction of a vast network of torture facilities. But we would argue that even if the mandate were extended, which is unlikely given that Russia would veto it at the UN Security Council, it would still mean nothing. Rather than an international system that responds quickly and resolutely to genocide, we've somehow created one that, might lead to conviction of a single man some point 20 years from now, if we're lucky. An international system that cares more about pieces of paper and long debates between lawyers in windowless courtrooms than it does about women and children being slaughtered by the tens of thousands. If that is the case, should we be surprised that our era feels like an increasingly lawless one? Is it any wonder that men like Vladimir Putin feel like they can embark upon a war of imperial conquest, the lives of innocent people be damned? Warlords and psychopaths may be many things, but they're not usually idiots. If they can see that it's easy to get away with mass murder, why wouldn't they? As the New York Times recently noted, and we'll quote them here, in a broader sense, the killings in El-Fasher represent a collapse of the entire international system created to respond to genocide and mass atrocities. And by collapsing so dramatically, by failing so openly, the end of this system suggests that there's just only more of this lawlessness to come. That the would-be conquerors of the world will take heart, knowing that the only law remaining is might is right. And if that's true,